Hey folks, Nathan here. This is my YouTube channel, and this is the next of our mini Q&A episodes. I guess this is episode, 8 of the mini Q&A series. I'm this time pulling questions just from mini Q&A comments from video number 2 in this series. And it's all coming from one person who asked a crap ton of questions. I've had a couple times where this has happened, someone asking a crap ton of questions. We went ahead and did most of 2 and a tiny bit of 3 last time in terms of where the comments came from, the new questions came from. So now we're circling back to the questions that were posted on the comments for mini Q&A number 2 and building our number 8 here. So without further ado, the questions come from the Fezani Ferengi. I'm not sure what Fezani is, but I know what a Ferengi is because I just finished that giant Trek rewatch. All right, lots and lots of questions here, so I'll try to hit them so that we can still keep to our 20-minute or so time constraint here for these mini Q&As. First question asked by Ferengi is, at this point, would you say George Lucas failed to sell Star Wars to a company that will preserve his basic vision for it? My answer would be no. One being that I'm not sure how much of a vision Lucas had in some respects for where Star Wars would go, unless you're getting into the whole weird thing where recently he talked about how like the sequel trilogy would have to do with like microscopic like bacteria world force use or some crazy crap. But I think back to like what he did with the Clone Wars, and he was changing things up as he went along. He was changing what he himself had said before about what balance of the Force meant and things like that. How at one point he said essentially that what balance meant wasn't a balance of light and dark. It was the idea that what is light is good and natural, and that darkness, evil, is like a cancer upon it. So balance is essentially health, which means light side without much in the way of dark side. You don't have the cancer eating away at you. And then he completely changed his mind when the Clone Wars came around. And I look at things like Sunny Day in the Void, which he says was his favorite episode of the Clone Wars. It's based on Mobius and the art, and it sucked, George. It just sucked. It's a children's program that has the viewers and the characters both contemplating suicide. It sucked. That said, I think that right now it's too early to really tell whether or not we're going to see George Lucas's vision preserved, because what is the one reason we've been given for why we do not have, at least aside from a technical side, why we do not have the original unaltered versions of the original trilogy or even the prequel trilogy at this point in high definition or 4K? Why have those not been released that way? And the reason we've been given is that at least for the original trilogy, those originals don't still exist. They had to be taken apart to create the special editions and whatnot, so they're not in their original form anymore. To put them back together would be meaning to recreate it, kind of like what Harmy does with the specialized editions. And have to recreate it and whatnot, but doing so would revert it from Lucas's preferred vision, or preferred version in 2011 with the Blu-rays, into something earlier. But it would be reconstructing it, a creative process to make it happen, which would kind of be like doing something new. And therefore, they say, they are not only just going to stick to Lucas's vision of what he said the definitive version should be, 2011 Blu-ray cuts, but also they are not going to make new versions, which is what they would think of as recreating as a new version for some reason, the whole creative process aspect of it. Because that would be against sort of the memory of him and his contribution. Part of that, though, right now is because you got someone like Kathleen Kennedy in charge of Lucasfilm. I think Kathleen Kennedy's made some good decisions, some bad decisions, but one thing that she is definitely is essentially a Lucas loyalist. She is someone who has a personal affinity and friendship with and respect for Lucas. Until he's out of the picture, or until Dave Filoni with the TV shows are out of the picture, the chances of us seeing Star Wars heavily deviate from a Lucas, at least grounded vision of Star Wars seems unlikely. There are even things you can see now in the sequel trilogy. Yeah, they tossed out his original outlines, blah, blah, blah. Yes, they did. But there are still aspects of it that still echo some things that he talked about wanting to do as early as the early 80s in interviews in places like Time magazine. So right now, it's kind of one of those things where they're constrained, not because Disney and Lucasfilm can't just do whatever the hell they want, because now Disney owns it. Lucas has no ownership in it, no say over it anymore. but there is a personal relationship, a personal loyalty that people inside Lucasfilm still have towards Lucas, even though he is gone. So they're not really kind of letting it go as much as they might. Give it 10 years, 20 years, when those people are out of the picture, a new generation is heading things up who had no personal loyalty to Lucas, just a love for Star Wars, and we'll see what happens. But I don't think we can say definitively yet. So far, I'm not seeing it deviate enough to say that it was sold to the wrong company. Then again, if you watch the last episode, you'll note that in the tiers of how I just grab Star Wars films off the shelf to watch them, which some take as a favorites list, I just take as a, that's my current watching preference list. The films since the Disney takeover were higher up than the Lucas era ones. Probably because they're newer, flashier, better pacing, and I've seen them less, so I will want to watch them more. But, take it for what it is. Second question. Did he do a disservice to Star Wars fans by selling it to whom he sold it? No, I don't think so. They've got a good track record going with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so it made sense for if anybody's going to pick it up and launch new films with it. It sort of would make sense for Disney to do it. Disney tends to be as family-friendly, which is sort of what Lucas was going for, at least for the most part. They had the money to make it work, the money to make it happen, to make the deal work. I think the worst outcome would have been, and I know this is going to annoy some people, the worst outcome I think would have been he doesn't sell it off at all. He just sort of lets it fade off and die. Okay, I'm retiring, Lucasfilm's got it, and that's it. What happens to Lucasfilm as a company at that point? Does it continue? Does it fall apart like some of its subsidiary little arms like LucasArts? And if you don't have somebody coming in and paying a shit ton of money to buy Lucasfilm and the rights to things like Star Wars, do you then have a renaissance and a resurgence of Star Wars in the public eye the way that you did with The Force Awakens and since then? Or does it just continue to only exist in the realm of the Legends continuity of books and comics and so forth, which, while great for those of us who love the Legends continuity, would have eventually faded, kind of running out of stories and ways to tell them anyway. They're starting to go into weird genre-type stories by the time we got to about 2013. But, it's not going to survive as much as a cultural phenomenon without new films, new blood, new energy, new generations getting interested in it. Would that have even happened if left to Lucasfilm with Lucas retiring without selling it off? I kind of doubt it. He or she then asks, any other company you would have preferred, even if said company would have needed a bank loan to finance the movies? The only one I could think of would be Fox, just because they already were the distributors for the Star Wars films. They were the ones who gave the original Star Wars a chance when no one else did. But even then, that would be a moot point, because at this point, Fox is selling off its entertainment assets to Disney. The sale hasn't gone through yet. They're still getting through all the legal red tape and everything. But it looks like it's going to happen, which will wind up being a good thing in terms of the rights of the original films, right? Because right now, the distribution rights on all media for A New Hope would lie with Fox in perpetuity unless they purposely sell it off. And the rights to physical releases of the other 5 Lucas films, Lucas live-action films, remain with them until 2020. So selling it would allow us to have like box sets and stuff like that for home video collectors like me sooner, once it gets in the hands of Walt Disney Company. But I don't know. I mean, I can't really think of many that would do, the justice to it, and that really would be willing to throw as much money at expanding the franchise. I can't see a lot of these other companies being willing to put in as much in terms of, here's these new TV shows, and new movies, and these books, and these comics, etc., etc. I would see more playing it safe, I think, with other companies that wouldn't necessarily have as much financial oomph, or not already have the track record with Marvel Cinematic Universe to get people to think they could do it right. Then let's see, he asks, I was going to assume he. Yes, I did just assume your gender, because there's no way for me to know. What EU work, if adapted into 3 to 4 movies or a short TV series, would tap into the 2018 cultural and political zeitgeist best without extra plot lines or preaching added? Damn. I would almost say it would have to be stuff from the Clone Wars, from the original Clone Wars before the TV show launched. because those were interconnected stories. People like interconnected stories, right? The bigger, the better. They like to see things weave together, and those were really intricately woven together. But also there's sort of the pessimistic feel to them. There's a sense of, oh my God, this sucks and it's going to continue sucking, which is kind of like the atmosphere right now politically, and in much of culture. And they are new enough that a lot of the writing conventions, the writing style, is still the way that things are written. Like you look at a book that was written in the era of, the 80s or 70s, like some of the early stuff from Del Rey, and the writing style is somewhat different than what you would see now. And you go back even further, you see even more divergent styles. I think about, I just read in the last year, 2 years, I read The Silmarillion, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings trilogy in that order. And oh God, never, ever will I do that again, because it was ponderous as hell. But part of that is the writing style. The writing style is just not what modern audiences expect of a writing style. Although you can still get ponderous as hell in writing style in modern day, just as George R.R. Martin. But I think those would sort of tell their tale, give us relevance with the films, of course, because they're in between 2 and 3. But give us a chance to see heroics in times of darkness without having to necessarily be super preachy. And even get into things like modern issues on, that still surround things like abortion, right? When does life begin? What counts as life and whatnot? Because you have that whole issue of the clones in that era and what defines human life, what is a product versus what is a human, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd say stuff like that from that era. Maybe some of the stuff from shortly thereafter with some introspection like Kenobi. Next question. Same person. Told you. A lot of them. Let's see. You think if someone gained enough money through Kickstarter to continue some EU comics and books in a big way, Disney might try to shut it down, especially considering the bad PR situation they made for themselves post-TLJ? Yes, they would shut it down because that's illegal. Period. That is copyright violating. Period. If they're going to protect their copyrights, protect their IP, their intellectual property, and not essentially open the door to a legal precedent that would allow it to almost become fair use, or not fair use, public domain in the long run, then yeah, they would have to shut it down. That is not the same thing as fan films. Fan films they kind of turn a blind eye to, or if they're parody and documentary are okay with because they are under what's legal and copyright fair use. But yeah, somebody was like trying to remake a film, or someone was trying to take old stories and adapt them and whatnot in a big way. But if someone was like funding that through Kickstarter, not like private funds or anything like that, that makes it even worse. Oh, absolutely, that would be stomped. It would make Paramount's response to Axanar look like a mild fart in fandom. New question. In 2012, when Disney bought the franchise, could you have imagined a big mainstream newspaper like National Review would write down the sentence, "Star Wars was drafted into the culture war 6 years later"? Yes and no. Yes and no. I would argue that damn near anything at this point is being drafted into the culture war, like it or not. So regardless of what your story has, if it has anything in it that one side or the other could take as offensive or take as pro their side, anti the other side, it's pulled into it. That said, I don't think it's unique to Star Wars at all. So in the sense of, yes, I could have expected it, if we could have expected that we get into the environment where everything gets pulled in, then the fact that Star Wars is so gigantic of a franchise, of course it was going to be pulled in. On the other hand, I don't think we could have expected how extreme it has gotten over the last, say, half decade or so, 6 years, etc. So in that sense, no, we couldn't have predicted it. But I don't know that we could have predicted it for anything else either, or for much else. Maybe something like Star Trek that purposely, pushes into social issues and whatnot. But there's a lot of stuff that is overly politicized at this point, or overly culture warized. Yeah, that's not a word. That, frankly, you would not have expected would have ever been part of that type of thing, and yet it is. So yes and no, but neither so much because it's Star Wars, so much as just, predicting that cultural shift. And then the last one comes from the same person, and I guess we may have time for maybe one more. The question is, did you review all of Star Wars The Old Republic storylines on Star Wars Report, or is that an ambition you gave up on? Don't ask me when, but I recall you saying you planned on doing that on a Star Wars Report podcast. Maybe I'm just using the wrong search terms and you already did. So never on a podcast. I may have been on a podcast talking about what I was working on the Star Wars Timeline Gold at the time, which was working on the Old Republic and getting summaries in at times. I got all the summaries in for all the core storylines from the original game and some of the flashpoints and stuff after that, but I never got to the expansions and things like that, mainly because doing the timeline was already incredibly time-consuming as it was, and doing any of that stuff meant watching through video footage of entire campaigns as someone played through to catch the cutscenes and the dialogue and stuff like that, and I learned the first time with the Old Republic that was a ridiculous task to try to do. So I never got around to doing it by the time the Star Wars Timeline Gold ended, though to be honest, if the timeline had continued, I still would probably never have had time to do it. So it probably would have always been a hole of what was missing. But it was never to be covered on podcasts. It was always on the Star Wars Timeline Gold. The main stories from the original game are on there. Beyond that are not. I probably mentioned it, though, on Star Wars Beyond the Films at some point. Okay, cool. We got time for maybe one more. And I just did this as two. I meant one more, like this, except it came out... Anyway, we're wasting time. And God, it's getting hot, just like last time. Damn it with these lights. This comes from Mini Q&A number 3's comment section, where we left off last time with a question from Chris Clark. We now pick up with a question from David Noche, who says, question: when our daughter was born 4 years ago, I found myself reevaluating priorities for my hobbies and free time activities, not only from a standpoint of my time being more occupied with family life, but also because my mind naturally diminished the importance of some of those activities in light of more important and more rewarding responsibilities toward my child and my family. That's not to say that I don't still make time for my favorite hobbies like reading, Star Wars, a bit of gaming, etc., but I honestly feel as though all of that really takes a backseat to experiencing precious moments with my daughter. Has this happened to you, and is there anything in particular which has definitely been given a noticeably lower priority now with Cade being in your life? Cade being our son, who was born back on September 7th, who as of the time of recording this is not even 4 months old yet. So my answer to that would be yes. Yes, I can feel that already happening, priority-wise. The types of videos that I prioritize is very much determined by what I can record and when, and ease of getting into it, recording it, getting out, and then editing it later. The idea of doing video game streaming, is almost anathema, because how do I do that and not have to just stop whenever he needs something? But those are all kind of a practical standpoint. What really got me to notice how my priorities were changing in a big way, aside from just kind of the epiphany, I recognized that there was a moment early on where I was trying to still do everything the same way, and I was getting frustrated by how much I was having to not do that while I was taking care of him. That was even when my wife was still on leave. And I finally kind of hit a point where it's like an inflection point, and I realized, you know what? This is the important stuff. That other stuff, that has to take a back seat, and it needs to take a back seat. That my life is different now, and I either find a way to adapt to that, or I try to keep doing it the old way and I go crazy, or I grow resentful. And that's not good. That's not healthy. So there was an inflection point of that. But I think what really kind of drove it home is actually something that happened yesterday as of the time I'm recording this. So you may know, by listening to Cloud City Casino, that I'm a big PlayStation VR guy. I love PlayStation VR, but I've barely been able to play it since Cade was born because I don't want to put it on and not be able to keep an eye on him. Even if he's sleeping, it's just a paranoia thing of a new parent. But at one point, I sold off my original PlayStation 4 and replaced it with a PlayStation 4 Pro, because you get extra oomph and extra power for the PlayStation VR, and you get 4K. But primarily for that extra oomph to PlayStation VR, which on some games is quite noticeable. And the load times can be different, noticeable. So dig into PlayStation Pro, or PlayStation 4 Pro, and within less than a year of owning it, I want to say about 10 months of owning my PlayStation 4 Pro, the optical disc drive stopped recognizing discs, just died. You put in the disc, it sounds like it's trying to, nothing happens, you can't actually read the discs. And as a result, I had to send it off to get repaired. This is right around the time that Battlefront 2 was coming out, and I had just gotten paid extra money because I taught a bunch of extra students that semester, and I got paid for the first half of the semester worth of students. So with a little bit of extra cash in my pocket, I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go and get another PS4 Pro, and if that one comes back repaired in a way that I can still use, I'll have it as kind of a backup. Sure, why not? The thoughts you have when you're not realizing that you have a child you need to put back money for, or a child on the way, because we didn't know at the time yet. So I got the new PlayStation 4 Pro. That became the primary gaming device. Eventually the repaired one came back, sat in our living room, barely used it at all. I was sort of there as a backup, or for if I wanted to play something and didn't want to keep my wife up or something like that. And then came yesterday, when the newer of the two PS4 Pros had the same damn problem again. Exact same issue. Optical drive just died, stopped recognizing discs. Same shit, different device. SSDD still. And of course, this one I bought back in October when the other one died. It is now December. It is about 6 weeks out of warranty, so to repair it, I'm going to have to pay $170. Now, one could argue that the reason why I wasn't as shocked and dismayed as I usually would be of something technologically and expensive going haywire, which usually sets my anxiety off like crazy. You could argue that the reason why I wasn't as anxious was because, well, we still had that backup one in there. I can just pull it in and load the stuff on that while the other one's getting repaired. Yeah, it's $170, and that sucks, but it's still less than half of buying a new PS4 Pro again. So, okay. But I think really it was just kind of that this too shall pass kind of attitude that you got to take on just about anything when your priority is your child and your wife and your family. So it's kind of like I realized as I was walking around dealing with that and dealing with the customer service request and all that, it was not a frantic kind of thing, and it was not a, me cussing kind of thing. It was more just a, you know what, shit happens, whatever. And I think that's an attitude that I would not have taken prior to being a father, because it rearranged my priorities enough that that kind of thing isn't something that would set me off in any way. So, yeah, I'm only starting to see it, though, because it's really only been a few months now. I mean, give it a year, I'm sure it'll be vastly different. But as of now, very much sort of a reshuffling of priorities that I notice, but that so far hasn't caused a lot of noticeable changes in importance to things. It's almost like, it's not, put it another way, it's not so much that I've reorganized my priorities and I recognize where everything now lies, so much as he's prioritized at the top, everything else just kind of takes a general shift downward, and I'm only now starting to realize where they all fall relative to each other, whereas recognizing that he was at the top took almost no time at all, right? I guess that's kind of what I'm saying with it. But yeah, I think it's a phenomenon that anyone who has children hopefully will go through. Hopefully they're not going to keep putting other stuff ahead of the child, but unfortunately we know there are some pretty crappy parents out there, so yeah, I'm sure there are plenty of cases where that doesn't happen. But I like to think that if you're going to be a good parent, that should be one of the first things that starts to change in your mind within those first weeks and months. So, with that, we'll wrap up this mini Q&A. Thank you very much for the questions, and if you're still interested in posting your own questions for future episodes, put them in the comments. I will eventually go through and grab them, as I'm doing now, from these previous 6, and go through and put together some more mini Q&A episodes, as I record many in one sitting, with the same clothes, as it's getting hotter and hotter in the room in the middle of the night. Kind of the same process as last time. Again, thank you for your interest, and I'll see you on the next mini Q&A.